Hey there boys, today we're going to be talking about Lucky Pants and the meta hand cannon pairings with them. This week we've had the Corrupted as the GM, and it has also been offering the new Slammer Sword, which is really cool. I actually made a video about the Slammer Sword. If you are interested in learning more about it, make sure you check that out. I'll leave a link in the description. That being said, today we're going to be talking about GMs as a whole, and also some of the raid DPS applications that Lucky Pants might have, pretty much just looking at the wide use cases for Lucky Pants. If you don't know what they do, they basically are a handling exotic for PvP, but in PvE they have an additional functionality where they increase the damage of hand cannons for every shot that you land. Basically, you get a 10-second window after drawing out the gun, and every shot you land gives a stacking buff of 60% per shot, up to 600%. Normally, primaries are absolutely terrible DPS, but a 600% damage buff that has a decent length of time that you get it for is always going to be powerful even on a primary. It's worth noting that Lucky Pants actually doesn't work with most exotic hand cannon perks. Great examples include the Hawkmoon Final Shot, the Explosion on Malfeasance, and also Ariana's Vow only gets half of the buff. With this week being the Corrupted, we saw a really big chance for a really odd loadout that I didn't expect to be very strong to actually be a meta tier choice. And that setup is Stasis Hunter with the Lucky Pants Malfeasance setup. This has obviously been used before, and it's not a bad setup, but the fact that it was almost arguably the best thing to do for this strike is actually really surprising to me, but I definitely like to see the variety. While this setup is somewhat specialized for the Corrupted, since it is going to be a Taken and also an Overload Unstop setup, which is pretty much the perfect thing for Malfeasance and Stasis, I still think that this setup can be somewhat adapted to other GMs as well. Obviously, anything that is Unstop Overload as the champions is going to automatically be very powerful for this setup. However, if you have anything with Unstop, even Unstop Barrier for example, you could just run it with Solar instead of Stasis and use Radiant to get Barrier. Or you could just change out your second weapon to be a barrier weapon. There's a whole lot of different things you could do, and that's not even including when you have Warden's Law. Warden's Law is a legendary choice, and it is basically a double shot hand cannon, so it shoots 2 shots very quickly, so it builds up the stacks really fast. It also has a great DPS role in 4 times the charm and Vorpal Weapon. Pretty much the conclusion is that Malfeasance is better against Taken because it does have a pretty hefty damage buff against Taken. However, against non-Taken, Warden's Law will be doing more damage. In this setup, we're going to specifically look at the Stasis Hunter setup for the Corrupted Strike, which actually makes use of an Eager Edge Sword instead of a damage heavy weapon like you would normally use in a GM like a Sane person. And the only reason that we're able to get away with this is because, for starters, all of our champion stuff is covered by our subclass and Malfeasance. Pretty much, since Malfeasance is also our main damage, we get to use Forbearance as some of the best ad clear in the game, and again abilities for Overload. That leaves our heavy slot pretty wide open, so we actually choose to use an Eager Edge Sword just to do things faster and have a little bit more mobility to avoid getting shot. And that whole not getting shot thing is actually pretty important if you are using Stasis Hunter for this setup, because otherwise you have no survivability on Stasis Hunter. The Whisper of Rhyme kind of just sucks now. It got nerfed into the ground a while ago, so there's basically just no survivability except for maybe picking up orbs to get health, but you can't really do that often enough to call that real survivability like something like Restoration would give you. That being said, I still really like this build just because it is completely different than the normal triple Sino spam that we've been doing for a while for the meta of GMs. It's also nice because it's not very reliant on your teammates at all. In a triple Sino setup, you're obviously very reliant on your teammates marking the targets before the target dies, but in this one, you can absolutely carry teams completely on your own with this build. Now, I know in the background I'm using the Slammer Sword, however, you could use pretty much any Eager Edge Sword that you wanted to use. The technical optimal, I think, other than the Slammer, is going to be the Arc one, just so you can match Scavenger mods with the Forbearance, but it's really not that big of a deal. The main value that the Slammer gets is just having Cold Steel, lets you pretty much just have an extra choice of Overload if your abilities are out. However, you can always just be smart with your abilities and you won't have to deal with that. So now let's talk about the little things that you could change to this setup to make it work anywhere else. First things first, the subclass is actually probably the most flexible thing in this setup, ironically. Normally the subclass is pretty set in place for a given build, but in this case you can run Lucky Pants on pretty much any setup and be relatively successful. And honestly, most of the subclasses for Hunter actually have some sort of PvE use case. So if you're not sure what to use, I'd use whatever's best for your team and whatever you're best with. However, when it does come to Corrupted in specific, Stasis has a lot of things going for it, so keep that in mind as well. Moving on from the Grandmaster Nightfalls, we're going to have a look at the raid/dungeon DPS setups. This is basically your dedicated DPS loadouts and when you would want to use Lucky Pants in them, and how it compares to other choices, especially special weapons, since that's this thing's main competition. The first thing to note is that you are 100% able to do a loadout swap and use a Celestial Shot and then go into Lucky Pants. However, this does mean that it's in competition with something like Radiant Dance Machines or Dragon's Shadow, which are also very good for damage rotations. That being said, as with most things, it's going to come down to what kind of activities you're doing. If you're doing something really difficult, such as a GM or maybe a Master Raid or a Day 1 raid, I think that Lucky Pants are definitely a great addition as some backup damage. However, when you're trying to use it as a main damage method, I find it's really clunky to incorporate into damage rotations because if you mess up even a little bit, you get the 10-second cooldown that basically just kills your damage. I also noticed that sometimes it just won't proc the damage perk for some reason, even though the cooldown is over, and it just doesn't tell you or anything, and you basically just have to watch your damage numbers because you can't see the buff showing up because you have so many during your typical damage phase. And on the topic of having too many buffs, there's also the same issue of when you run out of the damage buff. You don't actually see when that is, and because you're getting so many different damage numbers from different sources, it's hard to tell when the damage buff runs out and when you should be switching to a different weapon. That being said, it's still infinite damage and it does it at a decent rate for the most part, so it still definitely has a use case, but I do think that a lot of people are overhyping how good it is for raid DPS. Because let's not forget, for something like raid DPS, it's really easy to just set up double special and just have two special weapons. Like, you could just be Izzy swapping and doing more rockets. You know, there's just so many different ways you could be doing damage for raid DPS and just a lot more competition for how you're doing damage. Whereas that is not the case when you're doing something like a GM, where pretty much the only competition is Xeno rockets. And obviously in that scene, this has the disadvantage of being a little less damage, however the advantage of obviously being able to use any heavy weapon you want, including Eager Edge. So as I typically like to do, I want to give you the information to come to your own conclusions on this. So make sure you let me know in the comments below, what do you think about this? Do you think that Lucky Pants are overpowered and maybe even need a nerf? Do you think that they're underpowered, or do you think that they're just right where they are? Also, let me know if I got any of the information wrong on Lucky Pants, because I have not really been using them for too long of a time. I pretty much picked them up this weekend just to try them out, had a really good time, and just started to take them everywhere to see how they felt. Anyway, that's going to do it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.